that might be completely different than someone who's experienced physical violence in a different way.
Right. Exactly. So I kind of hear you saying, it's that all these questions, they all kind of fit, and they might be an experience that someone may have one or multiple of them, but then the response to these might need to be different depending on what the response is. What are your thoughts on, so this is kind of, there's a couple of ways. So this is kind of as a initial point, right? Start something to start the conversation, at least open the door. If someone would like to, feels comfortable disclosing something like this that happened to them, and would like to talk more about it. Or potentially not. Some people, would rather answer this question, and they might still answer truthfully, but they don't want to talk about what happened, which is fine as well. What are your thoughts on what would be the best way to approach some people, in general, kind of about with these types of screening questions? Would it be better to be done on an anonymous survey like this, or perhaps like on a written or even anonymous, or on an online but not anonymous type of survey, or being asked in person? And who would be the best people you think to ask those questions? I realize that was a lot in one, so we can break it down as well.
Well, for the first part, I would say in some ways, like, anonymous is better for people in that, like, they can come forward and disclose this information, but also if they get, like, suddenly feel like they no longer want to continue with the process, it's, like, easier, like, in their own minds to kind of step away from it. Because you've submitted something, but, like, no one knows who you are and no one knows really anything about your situation. So it's easier for you to, like, you can very much operate at, like, what feels comfortable for you. And I think in some ways, like, an in-person meeting can be extremely overwhelming, like, regardless of what situation you're coming from. So I think a screening questionnaire like this is ideal for that first step of people who want to respond. In terms of who, I don't really know, like, who the best person to talk to or disclose this information would be.
Yeah, it can be tough, right? And a lot of it might have to do with, some things that come up in other groups is kind of, it might have to do a lot with trust in the relationship that you have maybe with that person. So we'll get there in a minute, just about kind of what aspects helps with that.
I think on the note of who should be asking these questions in the ideal world is, like, someone who you feel comfortable with, like you said, someone you can trust. And I think a lot of that has to do with someone that fits with your demographic. So, like, having you be, like, just honestly just a woman, like someone who identifies as she, hers, like, I feel so much more comfortable talking with you than I think I would talking with, like, a man or someone who was a lot older, or someone who had, like, a position of authority. Like, there's a lot of factors that go into it, like, sort of social factors, but I think just someone that's, like, very similar to you demographically, it just makes more sense because you feel more comfortable with them. Yeah. So I feel like that just kind of is, like, a good sense of trust.
Yeah, absolutely. That can be for a lot of people. It can be something, right, that helps to build that trust, and just kind of maybe a sense of a more shared experience potentially. Do you mind if I ask you, do you think that for you to do kind of similar experiences or demographics or gender, does any of that you think play a role, in your opinion, for comfort around asking these questions if he asks it?
I would say the primary factor would be gender. Not so much demographics for me, but I definitely think having someone of the same gender who, like, can understand potentially some of the things you're feeling is important, because you're more likely to trust them and they're more likely to gain your trust in those situations.
Yeah. That is something that's come across exactly. A lot of others have felt that way as well. What are some other parts? I'm curious to kind of changing gears a little bit, and close this for now, is in terms of, so oftentimes these types of questions are asked in healthcare settings. So sometimes it's at a annual physical, right? You might be asked some questions along these lines, or as athletes, right? We do a pre-participation physical that happens every year, and it's hopefully it's kind of a check-in. And sometimes it's with a team physician, sometimes with its primary care physician, whatnot. I'd love to get your thoughts on whether you think that would be an appropriate place to ask these questions, and then why or why not.
Just like be clear on the question. You were asking about the appropriate setting.
So the appropriate setting and whether, so one of the things, ideally is kind of having a provider or a person that you have a relationship with, right? You build a relationship with over time. And one of the questions is whether at a annual physical, either with a primary care provider or like a pre-participation physical, whether you feel like this would be an appropriate place to ask these types of questions.
Again, I apologize for the background noise. I'm just going to try to be, louder. But I think it would be an appropriate setting, but only if the checkup was like a sexual health checkup, because I think it could be a little bit alarming for someone just getting like a flu shot to be asked like 30 questions about like, their history with abuse, because that's pretty hard to just launch right into. So I would say if you're having a meeting or a checkup that was specifically about sexual health, and you had either a gynecologist or, I guess like a gynecologist, somebody who you might be talking to about your sexual history for like in a medical context, then maybe they could ask you if you would also be interested in filling out the survey for like data collection, or maybe if it was related to like STD testing, I don't know, but just like within a sexual health context, I think it would make sense.
So it sounds like priming, having kind of that context is important.
Yeah, definitely priming, and definitely, like I was mentioning earlier, with like the amount of communication related to like, you can leave if you want to, like we're not pressuring you into answering these questions, it's all optional, like making sure that that's very well communicated, because people do tend to have like some trauma or at least some uncomfortability related to these answers. So you have to be very gentle when like approaching them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say like, for like a PPE or a primary care, it wouldn't necessarily be the right place, because I know even those questionnaires already ask questions about mental health, and I'm not sure how, like, the experience with like people I know and run in my circles, I'm not exactly sure how honest people are on those questions either, because it kind of feels a bit out of context for what you're doing, and almost that like you're trying to get cleared physically for sports. So like that's kind of where your primary focus is. And so I think, going off what was said earlier, it would have to be in like with priming or in a slightly different context that's like more suited for asking questions regarding like sexual health or like sexual violence, because I think primary care just like isn't quite the avenue for that. I found.
It sounds like, so yeah, exactly. It sounds like it's kind of that, it's more kind of this, it's just you're focusing on other things perhaps during that time. Are there other avenues you think outside of kind of healthcare, that especially as college students or college athletes specifically, that you think would be a more appropriate place or way to be kind of screening for these types of things by asking these types of questions?